Thank you everyone for joining us. This is our panel on transport. What could Labour do in government? Transport, I'm struck by the fact that it's one of those areas of policy that affects us pretty much every day. When I talk to people about politics, it just comes up quite naturally as something which affects their everyday life in all sorts of profound ways, whether it is their journey to work or their journey to see their family or to the shops, or where it's the quality of the air that they breathe. It also has a bit of a deeper significance, particularly from, I guess, a northern perspective. I live in Manchester, sometimes try and get across to Sheffield or Leeds and find that almost impossible in this day and age. It feels too much to ask for some reason, because, as I'm sure Lou will come on to, transport's not doing great, particularly outside of London. At the Fabian Society, our transport policy recommendation particularly focuses on buses, which are used by a large number of people, far larger than rail, although rail is of course very important. And we recommend that rather than letting mayors pick up the bill and take the political risk and initiative around franchising, that central government should step in and work with them to do that. We recommended that in our Commission on Poverty and Regional Inequality report of July last year, and that's something we'd certainly like to see Labour run with. But without further ado, I'll hand over to Lou, and then we'll come to the panel afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Luke, and thank you for talking about Manchester to Sheffield. Whenever it's talked about east-west, everyone just always assumes everyone's going to be leaving Sheffield and travelling over the other side of the Pennines. Thank you so much for having me here today, and happy 2024, happy election year, finally, we're almost there. And I want to talk to you, as Luke said, about Labour's plans for power and plans for transport reform, because, as has just been said, I don't think there's anything much more emblematic than the last 14 years of failed Tory government and failed Tory ideology than the broken state of our transport system. We all know it, we all see it, we can all feel it. Bus routes have been axed across the country in their thousands. Train cancellations are at their highest level on record. Strikes have caused chaos across the public transport network. And the cost of owning a car is creeping up, especially for the poorest and the youngest. And what does our current Secretary of State choose to spend his time doing? Ruminating over bizarre conspiracy theories about 15-minute cities. Perhaps if he'd spent less time on Reddit forums and more on resolving the industrial dispute, he wouldn't have cost our economy more than £1 billion in the first national strike on the railways in more than 30 years. And the state of our transport network is more than just an inconvenience. It's a barrier that is holding back our economic growth and our ambition for net zero, and it's depriving millions of people across the country of opportunity. Just last week, I met a retired woman who lived in quite a big village in the Peak District, just north of Sheffield. She relies on the bus to get to the shops, to get to the doctors and other public services, to see friends and family. She no longer has any bus at all on a Sunday servicing her entire village. And during the week, it doesn't turn up when it should, if it turns up at all. She told me that she is moving house because she can no longer rely on public transport. That is a truly damning state of affairs in modern Britain. And in a cost of living crisis and a climate crisis, we should be doing everything we possibly can to encourage people onto public transport. Instead, the Tories have sat back and allowed, if not actively encouraged, managed decline. And after 14 years of decline under the Conservatives, the Labour Party does not underestimate the scale of the challenge in front of us. But if we are given the privilege of being elected this year, make no mistake, we will be a transformative government, a mission-driven government. Last year, Keir set out our 5 missions to help us build a better Britain. Achieving the highest growth in the G7, breaking down the barriers to opportunity, growing the green economy, making Britain's streets safe, getting our NHS back on its feet. These are our bold ambitions for the country, and transport is key to delivering each of them. But right now, transport is too often a barrier to the change we need to see. Today, I'm here to tell you it can and it will be part of the solution. November last year marked the 30th anniversary of the privatisation of our railways. In the decades since, we've seen the consequences of this failed approach. Taking the train should not be a lottery in the 6th richest country in the world, but that is what it has become under the Tories. Chaos and cancellations are now permanent features. Industrial action is shutting down the network for days at a time, and unaccountable operators are being rewarded with this, with millions of pounds in profit. Just this week, you may have seen Avanti gloating about the free taxpayers' money that they claim is too good to be true. The system is fragmented, it's wasteful, and it's simply not delivering for passengers or for the taxpayer. Now, I'm someone who doesn't just talk about public transport in the north, I use it week in and week out. And let me tell you, nobody who takes the train in the north believes Avanti West Coast should be getting anything that seems too good to be true, or have earned some Northwesterners in the room, or have earned an extra week of running our railways, let alone the 9-year contract extension handed to them by the Tories. But this is the system created by the Conservatives. Rewards for failure with no trace of accountability. And it's not just who runs our railways that is the problem, it's the Victorian infrastructure that our trains are still forced to rely on. Last year, when the renowned master of political communications, Rishi Sunak, headed to Manchester to make his bold announcement that HS2 would never reach that same city, we thought surely this government could not become any more out of touch. We were wrong. On the way back, he bragged about ending high-speed rail to the north with a picture of himself on his private jet. He then published a document called Network North, a plan scribbled on the back of a fag packet which promised extensions to roads that didn't exist, tram lines that had already been built more than a decade before, re-announcements of projects, and claimed that it would level up the north by filling in potholes in London. This fiasco has exposed the staggering incompetence and complacency at the very top of our government and made it clearer than ever that it is the Tories who are holding Britain back. And it is this same failed approach right across our public transport. 37 years ago, the October, just before I was born, buses were deregulated. And we've seen the consequences of this disastrous decision play out across the country, not least in my home county of South Yorkshire. The last decade of neglect on our railways and on our roads has left Britain lacking far behind our neighbours. In Europe, on average, 67% of people can reach their city centre within 30 minutes on public transport. In the UK, that figure is only 40%. And things have been getting worse, not better. We've lost thousands of local bus services, and this trend has particularly hit rural communities. It's now estimated there are 1 million people stranded in transport deserts in the southwest and northeast alone. That is why, over the last year, I've been travelling the country to hear people's real concerns about the state of our local bus services. And everywhere I hear the same thing. It's holding us back from work, from education, from friends, from family. For the last few decades, our transport systems have been defined by the Tories' failed free market experiments. But there's been one exception, London. While the rest of the country was left stuck with unreliable, unaccountable and sparse services in decline, London has showed us what can happen when you put power over transport in the hands of those who use it every day. Today, London's transport system is a shining example of what reliable, fast, integrated and affordable transport can look like. It's the driver of the capital city's economy, and it's the envy of cities across the world. But too often, when it comes to transport, we hear complacency from the government. The idea that we simply have to settle for less, and that functioning, reliable transport systems are simply a nice to have, but they're not. They are essential and they are deliverable. And we're not sitting around waiting for election day to start delivering our Labour vision. Labour mayors up and down the country are already seizing the opportunity and taking back control of their public transport networks. From Greater Manchester to Liverpool to West Yorkshire, where they're ending this failure and taking back the control of their buses through franchising. Or Tracy Braben in West Yorkshire, who's making her mission to make her public transport network safe by putting PCSOs, particularly to make it safe for women and girls. Or in my own backyard in South Yorkshire, where Oliver Coppard is taking the Supertram network into public ownership. Transport is already letting Labour put our missions into practice locally, and we will go further nationally. The next Labour government will build a transport system fit for the future and call time on the decades of failed approach. We'll reform our transport system so it can deliver for the country. And we will radically reform our railways so they are solely and single-mindedly delivering for passengers. To achieve this, the next Labour government will bring our railways finally back into public ownership. Now, that's necessary but not sufficient. We will bring our rail infrastructure and our rail services together in a single, unified, publicly owned and passenger-focused body that will run a modern rail system to serve Britain. It will be responsible for the day-to-day operational delivery of the railways and improving the experience for passengers. And passengers will be the heart of its mission, objectives and incentives. Everything from executive pay to unlocking future investment will be tested and measured against progress in making the railways safe, reliable, quality, affordable, efficient and accessible. It will be rail experts and customer service professionals who will be given the commercial freedom to deliver improvements for passengers and generate growth for the railways. As Secretary of State, I won't be running the railways day to day, but I will be passenger-in-chief, holding them to account on behalf of the passenger and requiring them to grow our railways on behalf of future passengers. After years of dysfunction, paralysis, dither and delay, the railways will finally have the leadership and the plan for reform. Because a unified, publicly owned, accountable railway is not about ideology. It is a pragmatic way forward that simplifies the railways and can put passengers at their heart. And on our buses, Labour will give every local transport authority the power to take back control of their bus services, extending the power to franchise services, which currently is only available to metro mayors, to every community that wants it. We'll lower the legal hurdles and costs to franchising. We'll end the costly and time-consuming hurdles which delay much-needed reform. And we will reverse the Tories' ideological ban on new publicly owned bus companies so that local transport authorities can both own and control their local bus networks. That is how we will end the broken system that is driving the decline of our bus services and forcing communities apart. Anyone who has experienced our fragmented and dysfunctional transport system knows this is something we have to do. You know it if you've ever turned down a job offer because you couldn't rely on the journey to work. You know it if you've ever said no to a late shift because you couldn't afford the taxi home. You know it if you've missed school or college because your bus never arrived. You know it if you've ever staved in because you couldn't plan a safe trip back at the end of the evening. And you know it if you've ever missed a meeting or a family event because your train was cancelled. Our vision is ambitious for transport. It's ambitious for every community across the country. It is transformative, it's mission-driven, and it is our plan to take back control and get Britain moving again.
Thank you very much, Lou. Exciting stuff, not just for me as a bit of a transport nerd. I'm pleased to be joined by a fantastic panel of people. We have, as well as Lou, we have Sylvia Barrett, the Director of Policy and Research at the Campaign for Better Transport. We have Seb Dance, the Deputy Mayor for Transport for London. We have Councillor James Beckles from Custom House Ward in Newham. But first I'm going to turn to Seb to give us a few thoughts. Thank you.
Thanks, Luke. I had a dream last night. I have very many odd things happen in my dreams, but one of the oddest was that it involved, for some bizarre reason, taking a high-speed train from Manchester to Leeds, and it took 28 minutes. And I thought, wow, this is fantastic. And I woke up and realised that's not where we live. Clearly, I live and breathe transport even when I'm not in my lucid moments. And clearly, we are talking about something, as you said, Luke, in your introduction, that is central to the way in which we live our lives. And I think, Lou, you've given a very good overview of the kind of things where it can affect people very negatively indeed, including, of course, in such vital elements as the jobs that we do and the places that we live. And, of course, for many of us, it's also a solution to one of the greatest problems, if not the greatest problem that we face, which, of course, is climate change. But really, I think for the vast majority of people, what they need are basically three things, which is affordability, availability, and accessibility. And the reality, of course, is that far too many of our communities have either none of those or just one or two of those when it comes to their transport system. We're very lucky in London, and thank you, Lou, for the shout out to the work that we're doing here, to have an extensive public transport system. Of course, London is the home of the first metro system in the world, and we haven't stopped there, of course. We have had a lot of innovations in the transport system in London. But the reality is that it's still a bit of a patchwork, even in a city with such a good system as this one. We're actually sat in a part of the city, I should say, by the way, that we have an 80% target across the whole of London for public and active transport by 2041. And we're actually sat in a part of the city where they've already vastly exceeded that target. In the City of London, it's at 98%, so way well done, City of London. But I think the reasons for that might be slightly obvious given its geography. Other parts of the city are not anywhere near that 80% target. In fact, we have some parts where we're in the mid to high 50s, which is quite high given the national average, I might say, but still not high enough where we need to be. And the reality, of course, is that in outer London, the transport system is not as dense, it's not as well connected, and the options that people have are fewer. So we have to make sure that public transport is frequent, that it reaches more places, and that's what lies at the heart of our plan to increase the number of bus kilometres in the city. We've already added 1 million this year alone, and the Superloop, which is the new the ring of express buses that the Mayor announced at the end of last year, and which is now rapidly nearing completion in terms of completing that full loop, will add 4 million bus kilometres every single year to the number of bus kilometres in London. And already there has been a 62% increase in ridership on one of those routes. So there was an existing express route where we've doubled the frequency, where we've increased the quality of the buses so that they're now fitted with all of the amenities that people might come to expect on a premium product, at the same cost, of course, as the regular bus service. And that's seen a 62% increase already. So we know that these connections work. We know that people's travel patterns are changing, and that increasingly travelling from out-of-town centre to out-of-town centre is a bigger part of people's lives. Of course, everyone will know about the Elizabeth line, and I won't stop talking about it because it is a thing of beauty. Yes, there are big problems with it, and a lot of that comes down to the lack of funding that the government has put into the national rail infrastructure, particularly west of Paddington. But already, some 4.2 million journeys take place every single week on this one line alone. 1 in 6 of all rail journeys in the country takes place on this one line alone. And Thursday, the 21st of September, is flashed in big red lights on my briefing. 720,000 journeys took place on that one day alone, and it's regularly scoring very highly in terms of customer satisfaction. It's an old adage, but it works. When you build it, people come. And of course, the most proof that we have in terms of building completely new infrastructure from scratch and providing a completely new medium for which people can travel around the city is the cycle network, where we have more than doubled the size of the network since 2018 and trebled it since 2016. Cycling levels are now 13% higher than they were in 2019, which is remarkable given that Londoners were overall travelling less than pre-pandemic. And of course, and this is a very important point, we are seeing signs that a much more diverse range of Londoners are taking up cycling as well. But we do need to talk about affordability. Public transport will not become the default option for people if they cannot afford it or if there is a cheaper alternative. On fares, you will have seen that the Mayor has announced a fares freeze. Because of the fares freeze that the Mayor introduced in his first term and second term before the pandemic, his first term before the pandemic, his second term is after the pandemic, the fares that we pay now are 14% lower than they otherwise would have been. This is a crucial factor in ensuring that we keep ridership up. The government often likes to talk about a zero-sum game, saying, well, if you provide money for London's transport infrastructure, you can't provide money elsewhere. It's complete nonsense. We know that investment in transport infrastructure generates revenue. For example, the Elizabeth line, which cost 19 billion, was over budget and it was over time. We shouldn't be relaxed about that. But ultimately, it generates some 42 billion every year in economic value. So these things pay for themselves, and it's not a zero-sum game, and it is not the case that if you cut investment in London, you will somehow have a bigger pot for the rest of the country. We need to invest in London as well as the rest of the country. So there are many, many ways in which we can measure success. we have the Mayor's Transport Strategy, as I said, which has the 80% target at its core. It's the thing that we live and breathe every single day. And we are currently at 63% across the city. I said that the City of London was 98 and other boroughs are 58, but our total across the whole of the city is 63%. It is essential that we keep that focus on providing affordable, accessible and available public transport. Those three elements are brought together, and I think Lou's plan for the country shows that there is a vision on how we can achieve that nationally. If we can achieve that in every city across this country, we will move huge strides in solving, as I say, that existential crisis we all face, but also making our cities a better place to live, work and visit.
Thank you, Seb. For those following the time, we are running a little bit behind, so if people could stick to the 3 minutes. But over to you, Sylvia.
Thank you very much. For those of you that don't know Campaign for Better Transport, we're the national transport charity. We're non-partisan. We promote all forms of sustainable transport, from active travel to shared mobility, for the benefit of the passengers, of society as a whole, and the environment, of course. And although we cover all forms, we have focused, of course, on bus and rail quite significantly. And that's because of two main reasons. Firstly, public transport is very important for, as I said, for passengers, for society, because of health, because of environmental reasons. And thank you to Luis for mentioning our Transport Deserts report. That was pre-pandemic. Already there were so many gaps in our public transport system, with lots of people being left behind. And of course the pandemic made that need to support the public transport system even greater. The government has, of course, supported the bus and rail networks during the pandemic, and that was a good thing. But there have been lots of mixed messages, we feel, from government. And while there was support during the pandemic, afterwards the government required substantial spending cuts by train operators. We've seen commercial bus services left to wither away, and we've had widespread cuts and reductions in services. We've had more money allocated for buses through the National Bus Strategy, but the cuts are ongoing. We have had the £2 bus fare cap, which has been very welcome, but at the same time, rail fares have continued to increase. We have had investments in the north announced, yet to be delivered, but at the expense of cutting HS2. And we have seen the Alstom's factory in Derby, the rail factory, at the threat of closing down because there haven't been these consistent orders in new trains and investment in the network. The net zero commitment is there, and transport is, of course, the biggest contributor to our carbon emissions. But it's not, many people will lead you to believe that electric vehicles will solve that problem. But electric vehicles are not enough. It is, of course, very important, but we need to see significant modal shift as well, away from car driving to public transport and active travel. And what needs to happen in terms of what the next government needs to do? There are a number of top lines which we are calling on the next government to commit to. First of all, prioritize public transport as the essential public service that it is. The way to do that is to continue and have long-term spending commitments for bus and rail. And that would allow the next government to guarantee that every community will have a minimum level of service of bus and rail infrastructure, and that no community is left behind. We need to substantially improve services if people are to consider using public transport more instead of their private car. And another way to do that is to rebalance the pricing signals away from car ownership and towards public transport, so enabling a significant reduction in public transport fares and having the right tax signals for driving as well. Last but not least, it's to require local authorities to deliver significant carbon reduction. And the way to do that is, when it comes to the different transport modes on rail, it's imperative that we continue seeing that reform of establishing the arm's length body. The current government has committed to it, but obviously there's no progress on this yet. We need to see a strategy for network growth when it comes to rolling stock and traction as well. And fares and ticketing reform, very important, making sure that fares are affordable and simple for everyone. For buses, we want to see, yes, franchising for every community, but also models that, we've got franchising minus, we have enhanced partnership plus, all the models in between, because one size won't fit every community. And moving away from the fragmented competitive funding pots towards 5-year funding settlements for every transport authority. Ring fencing, money for buses, because there's money that comes from the local government department, but it's not ring fenced, and it's going to other services. And making sure that socially and economically necessary services are statutory requirements. So not only local authorities currently have a duty to identify the need for any services, but not to fund them and deliver them. So a mixture of funding and improvements, but also regulatory changes.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sylvia. James.
Thanks. I'm James. And I'm here to advocate for the role of local government and local authorities at the heart of any government strategy for transport. Local authorities are at the heart of developing a coherent and workable transport strategy and developing infrastructure. Local authorities understand how their populations move, they understand their transport needs, and they understand their transport requirements. And also how best to shift their populations from particular modal, from car into different modal transports. So therefore, their engagement, and I'm glad Lou touched upon it, is quite key in developing any sustainable, credible, and viable projects. Labour's transport priorities have to meet the needs of the wider national interests, but also have local interests at their heart. It can't be a top-down approach. We've seen what happens when this government has done that. It has to involve through consultation, but also through the involvement of leaders, whether at the local level, the hyperlocal, which I represent in my borough, but also at regional. So the Sadiqs, the Andys, and the Tracys, and also the Olivers of this world, bring them into the conversation. They will be they will be focused and key here. Transport can't sit alone as a separate department, or it can, but it needs to be more joined up. We've heard a lot over the years about joined up government, and I think really it needs to be a joined up government. When you're in local authorities, you are often faced with three main departments. You're faced with transport, DLUC, that's the Department of Levelling Up, Housing and Communities. I always forget the communities part. And you're also faced with the Treasury. Now, each has their different competing interests, but each has to work together because to deliver any coherent strategy. Transport, yes, will write up the policy. Treasury will fund it, and DLUC will decide who gets the powers and how that will be delivered. We're quite lucky in London that we have somewhat of a devolved transport system and other metro mayor areas where they can decide and they can see who, how, and why transport initiatives and infrastructure should be put in place. However, more powers need to be devolved back to local areas, put local people at the heart of transport and of transport policy. If you look at Newham as a fantastic case study, I would say that. I'm a councillor there. We've got an airport, we've got the A13 major road going through it that links central London to South Essex, and we've got the Silvertown Tunnel, which we're getting grudgingly, Seb. But we're not short of transport modes or transport means. It has its challenges. There are other areas throughout the country which have disparities. However, we are rich in transport, but it does offer us different opportunities to look at how do we reach net zero, how do we help the government in its targets in doing so, whether it's through lampposts and charging facilities. And the local authorities are key to doing that. many local authority areas have Labour administrations. They're putting their principles and their policies into practice, and it's through understanding the needs, the wishes, and the developments of local areas that Labour, I believe, will have an access and a route to power by listening to what local authorities want and also implementing their strategies, because we are doing it. We are at the coalface, and we're implementing now.
Brilliant, thank you. Well, so let's, we've heard from our panel, let's hear from our audience who has a question. Gosh, that's quite a showing. Please wait for the microphone, because we do need, in fact, I think, is the idea to go and stand at that microphone. Am I right? So there's a microphone there. Please do use it for people who have access needs and people online as well, of course. So, and the person right next to the microphone, let's start with you, if you wouldn't mind. Please ask your question. I'll take 3 questions and then we'll go to the panel.
I didn't position myself here for this reason. My name's Jane Roberts. I happen to chair Living Streets, but that's I guess partly why I'm asking this question. I wanted to ask the view of the panel with regard to how you see walking fitting in to transport. I completely get why, particularly in a run-up to a general election, that you must talk about rail and buses and all the rest of it. I get that, and walking doesn't appear very sexy. However, once in power, just how you see that fitting in strategically, because all these modes of transport have to fit together. And actually, I quite liked Seb's talking about accessible, affordable and available, and actually walking hits all of those, and with an incoming Labour government with incredibly constrained public finances, my God, actually you get an awful lot of bang for very little bucks if you put money into promoting people to encourage walking and improving the walking environment.
Thank you for your question. See those hands again, and I'll go to yourself there. So, did you want to go to the microphone there, I'm afraid? Oh, you can both go if you want. Sorry, I wasn't clear. I did want the man, I'm afraid, but you can both go. Just go one after the other, it's fine.
I'll let ladies go first.
Beth Lacani, I live in London, but I have a sister who lives in Lancashire, and yes, they don't get a fair share of the bucks, definitely. And as a result, she doesn't travel to Manchester because she's afraid the trains just won't go back to where she lives. That is an appalling restriction on her freedom. And transport is freedom. I have epilepsy, and therefore the freedom pass I have and the access to the good transport in London is literally a pass to freedom. But one thing I would like to ask, and it's relevant therefore to everyone, is in London they have introduced, which is quite right, a cycle system, so that encouraging people to cycle. But I do question the way it's been done and the amount of checking on how it works, because London roads and elsewhere in Britain, roads are relatively narrow. And if you leave a main road with just 2 main lines, then you get blockages. The result is it takes buses much longer to reach their destination. They're constantly stopping and starting, and that is less safe for people who are standing, particularly if they're not either healthy or they're elderly and not very stable.
Thank you for your question. Cheers. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Paul Hodgkins. I'm a member of the Labour Party, but I'm here really just as a private citizen. My first Fabians conference has been extremely good, very, very interesting. Lou, you said that Labour in government will be a transformative government when it comes to transport, and you said that too often transport is a barrier to change, and Labour will make that fit for the future. I just wondered what the panel view was then in terms of the 5 missions, and whether the panel feels transport has been knitted through Labour's 5 missions adequately or not. And if I may, Sylvia talked about long-term spending commitments for transport and prioritising that. And I wondered what's the panel's view in terms of Labour's position on long-term economic plan, fiscal rules, and sticking to them, and whether that will constrain that ambition.
Brilliant. Thank you for those questions. So I'll take answers from the panel now, and if the members of the panel could just respond to whichever of those questions they want to answer, if that's okay. I'll go to you, Lou, first.
Thank you. Well, Jane, a really, really important question, and you're absolutely right. Investment in active travel returns an enormous return on your public investment in both walking and cycling, and that's a big part of why we want to devolve as much both on bus and rail, but also keep crucially those decisions around active travel at local authority level. If authorities, either at local authority or strategic transport authority level, have proper power over their public transport timetabling operations, then they can make decisions that allow active travel to fit around that as well. It was why I mentioned, the Secretary of State's conspiracy theories around 15-minute cities. It was so utterly demeaning of him to focus on that at the Tory party conference last year, when what he's talking about is local people making decisions for themselves. And as a constituency MP, I get far more requests from people asking for improved cycle lanes and better, and road safety measures, particularly around schools and particularly in built-up residential areas. And those decisions absolutely must be kept as close to communities as possible. That's why we, rebutted hard against the Tories' pathetic attempts to go into their conference with a war on the motorist type thing. I think that rebounded really, really badly on them. So I work really closely with Chris Boardman and Active Travel England in developing those plans, but that's very much in my thinking that that is a very, very good benefit-cost ratio. And Paul, for me, I think transport is absolutely, as I said, mission critical, and it is essential to delivering every single one of those missions, particularly those top two on growth and net zero. But you can't allow people to access opportunities without connecting them to those opportunities. We can't get the NHS fit for the future without tackling harmful levels of air pollution. And you can't make people feel safe to be out on the streets if you don't tackle crime and harassment on public transport as well. But I would love it if all my colleagues talked about transport as much as I do as well. So make that case to my shadow cabinet colleagues as well. On the long-term spending point, it's really important. And in response to the government's very, very short-sighted and very last-minute decision to cancel HS2 and what they put in its place, what I was very resistant to doing was repeating exactly that tactic and coming up with an alternative infrastructure strategy immediately in response. So I was with nearly all our Labour mayors yesterday and our mayoral candidates, and we are working together to develop that long-term infrastructure strategy so that it is credible, and it means that the plan we put to the electorate come the general election will be the one we deliver. And I've appointed Jürgen Mayer, the former CEO of Siemens, with a very eminent board of infrastructure experts to look at the lessons that need to be learned from HS2, but also other infrastructure projects, to make sure that we re-inject some public confidence that Britain is capable of delivering the long-term infrastructure that we need, but also from investors and financiers as well.
Brilliant, thank you, Lou. You have to go at 4:05, I should say, so when it gets to 4:05, feel free to slip off. Seb.
Yeah, thank you. Jane, walking and wheeling are absolutely essential parts of this. The vast majority of public transport journeys incorporate walking or wheeling at one end or the other. And of course, it's hugely important that we get the infrastructure in the public realm right. My mum used to say that a pedestrian is just a motorist who's found somewhere to park, which I think was her generation's way of showing respect to pedestrians. And of course, actually, we have to ensure that some of the planning decisions that were taken with the car at the centre are revisited so that we incorporate walking and wheeling as an essential part of the mix. And of course, it's healthier. And this is a hugely important part of the mix. If we have 20 minutes of exercise every day, we are healthier, we live longer and better. So we should very much incorporate that messaging as well. And then, Becca, in terms of the public realm and the improvements we make, it shouldn't be one side pitted against the other, but you're right, when there is a limited geographic space, clearly there are going to be some solutions that work in some areas that don't work in other areas. And I think this war on motorists line that the Tories have alighted on kind of rests on the notion that you can only have one or the other. And of course, the car is always going to be part of the mix. The car is an essential part of the mix for many people. What we really want to do is to have those essential car journeys made easier. And actually that requires fewer people choosing to make unnecessary journeys by car. And that means, of course, improving the infrastructure around including cycle lanes and indeed the walking environment. If we get the balance right, then it's a win-win.
Thank you, Seb. Sylvia?
One thing to add on walking, of course it has an essential role and it comprises many journeys that we make day to day. But of course it needs to go hand in hand with investment in public transport. There are lots of basics we need to sort out when it comes to walking, such as the state of our pavements, pavement parking, making sure that everyone has safe crossings, especially around schools and other employment centres and high streets. But unless you substantially improve public transport as well for those longer journeys, I guess walking can then become part of the mix for longer journeys if we've got the mixture of transport options for those journeys. And when it comes to local authorities making decisions on that, of course it helps if the government rhetoric is supportive of those sorts of improvements. But there are also many authorities that don't have the ambition to deliver that. Not every area is a London or a city centre, and many councillors shy away from actually explaining the benefits of improvements to transport locally. So perhaps some requirements on local authorities to deliver a basic level of provision, plus the right mixture of tools locally in order to incentivize those sustainable trips.
Brilliant, thank you. And over to you, James.
To touch on Jane's question about walking, and it does tie in well with 15-minute neighbourhoods. Now, depending on which government minister you speak to, they either get very frustrated or they start frothing at the mouth. But it's far from being conspiracy theories. It's actually saying, how do we make neighbourhoods much more accessible? How do we improve it so that people can shift away from car but walk more or cycle more? And it's about design, it's about planning, it's about urban regeneration and all these other areas. But all of it touches on a good transport policy, which and good ministers who support local authorities who make those shifts and want to develop 50-minute neighbourhood strategies. In terms of fair share of transport and funding, I would completely agree. I think there's a lot of focus on London. I will always champion London and champion Newham, but I do think other areas do need to benefit from that. An example being is Cambridgeshire. Looking at their bus network, they took it in-house or insourced. I won't use the word nationalised because there's some people who are very uncomfortable with that, but they insourced it and they've offered a £2 fare and ride, and that's made transport around Cambridgeshire a lot easier. It was supported by a Labour administration working with other political parties, but it's now implemented and it's been very successful.
Thank you, James. I've been bullied by Lou into asking one more question. I have one more question from the audience, but she said she's going to stay till 4:10 if we do that. So, do you want to pick them as well? Go on.
You're right, shall I just
Go on, take over. No, I'll do it. It's fine. So yourself right at the back there, sir, with the glasses. Yep, that's you. Thank you.
Hello, panel. My name's Andy. I'm just a Fabian. I just want to know, are train fares currently too expensive? That's hopefully a rhetorical question. And if they are, by what scale of ambition have we got to reduce them?
There we go.
Let me take that one. Okay, I've set myself right up hostage to fortune, didn't I? They're demanding more questions. Well, look, I mean, as Sylvia said, rail fares have outstripped the price of fuel consistently over the last 30 years. And as I said in my speech, in a cost of living crisis and in a climate crisis, we should be doing everything within our power to get people onto public transport. So in that context, yes, of course, they are too expensive. The Tories have promised fare and ticketing reform over many years now and done absolutely nothing about it. There's been a pretty near miss this week in LNER's announcement. They announced a pretty rubbish new, advanced, slightly more flexible ticket. And that is a result of Department for Transport and Treasury meddling in the rail industry. The vision for our unified publicly owned railway service is that, as I said earlier, you give commercial freedom to customer service and railway professionals and then allow a test and trial approach across the industry. So ScotRail, for example, has abolished peak fares, and it will be really interesting to see what impact that has on the fare box. We want to see those kind of innovations across the board. So in some cases, yes, they will come down, but we need to balance that obviously with making sure that the railways are viable and sustainable. And I think the way to make sure that we always think of them as a public service is to talk about them being properly funded rather than subsidised. We don't talk about any other public service being subsidised. And clearly some elements of the railway will always have to require some taxpayer funding.
Thank you, Lou.
If I can very
yep,
quickly
go for
add
it.
to this. So our policies, we have been calling for a fares freeze for rail fares for a long time. And our argument is if the government can afford to freeze fuel duty for 13 years now, costing tens of billions of pounds, why not freeze fares? Yes, hundreds indeed. And I mean, that would have covered the cost of HS2. That would have covered investment in the railways. And we have to, of course, rein in costs on investment in rail as well. But it's just rebalancing those priorities.
Great. Well, I'm afraid we have to draw it to a close here. I'm afraid no more time for questions, but I'll ask each of the panel members to sum up quickly any final thoughts that they have. First of all, going to you, Lou, any final thoughts from you?
Well, look, I mean, the scale of interest in this room is replicated everywhere I go to speak on transport. I do honestly believe that investing in our public transport, reforming it so that it is sustainably and permanently transformed will be mission critical to the next Labour government, and that's why I have got a firm commitment in the King's Speech to have legislation to both reform our railways and our buses. And I will ensure, I know how important active travel and improving air quality, improving the healthy journeys and improving safer journey is to so many of you here in this room, but also those across the country who don't have a voice in our public discourse. I admit when I was given this role, I wasn't ready to leave being Shadow Northern Ireland Secretary, and I begged Keir not to move me over. But now I am chomping at the bit to be the next Labour Secretary of State for Transport and once and for all transform our transport in this country. So thank you so much for your interest and your support in our endeavours to do so.
Brilliant. Seb, any final thoughts?
We've touched on a number of key aspects, and we could probably talk about each and every one of those on their own for very much longer. And hopefully, we will continue this conversation in other forms going forward. But clearly, transport affects every single aspect of our lives, and it has sadly now entered the fray of the culture wars, them and us, and the divisions that are so easy to draw and the lines that people are so keen to draw, pitting cyclists against bus drivers, pitting motorists against pedestrians, and so on and so forth. And we have to realise that each and every one of us uses a variety of different modes each and every day. And the decisions that we make are based on a whole variety of factors, which we have covered some of today. And if we know that the transport system is more intuitive as a choice, that it is affordable, that it is accessible, that it is reliable, then people will choose the public transport system more often than they will other methods. That's the key policy challenge that we have, and to rise above this them and us rhetoric that we hear so often.
Thank you, Seb. Sylvia?
I would very much echo that. So my top ask is, of course, that sustainable transport is prioritized, and that's not trying to be divisive in any way. As Seb said, all of us use a range of transport modes all the time, and our survey shows that 3/4 of drivers want more options to travel in different ways. Many people are forced into driving all the time because of lack of different options. So providing those options for everyone is improving quality of life for all of us, and that's beyond improving health outcomes, beyond reaching net zero. For all these reasons that we need to be prioritizing public transport, and there's of course so much more to be said on detailed policy, and we have been working with Luis and the rest of the shadow team on shaping those policy details, and we're hopeful that we'll be able to see improvements in the not so distant future.
Thank you. James.
Thanks. Just to sum up, I would say for any policy has to be viable, needs to involve local authorities, needs to involve local people, whether it's at the hyper-local level or at the regional level. We're implementing net zero policies, we're looking at 50-minute neighbourhoods, we're looking at all modes of transport, and I think we should also ask the Labour Party to be bold, to be ambitious, and where possible avoid transport white elephants.
Brilliant. Well, and we'll finish there. So thank you very much to you for coming to this. We heard at the beginning, of course, from Lou, a story of Tory failure and reward for failure, which I think is sometimes in some ways much worse, isn't it? It just sort of encourages it, and the principle is just shocking. And how Labour mayors across the country are doing some great work. We heard about Labour's plans to deliver in government some exciting transport reforms. We heard from Seb about London's successes in buses and the Elizabeth line and cycle lanes and so on, but more work to do and more investment needed as well. We heard from Sylvia around the transport deserts that there are across the country, about public transport being a priority and long-term spending being particularly important, as well as regulation, from James about the crucial role of a local council in delivering transport as well. So thank you all for coming. I'm glad to see such interest in the subject. Could you thank the panel in the usual way? Thank you.